5 years. That was how long the Duke of Ashbourne had kept a dead woman's ribbon in his coat pocket, worn thin from the press of his thumb. He was 30 years old, and the household staff at Ashbourne Hall had long since stopped mentioning her name in his hearing, because the last time a upstairs maid had said it by accident, he had gone quiet for 3 days and eaten nothing but dry toast and black coffee, standing at the window of his study, staring at nothing at all. Her name had been Eleanor Winslow, daughter of a baron with more charm than sense, and she had died in a fire that took her family's estate to the ground in a single night, 5 years before this story begins. There had been no body to bury. The fire had seen to that. There had only been a locket, found in the ashes, half melted, with a portrait so blackened it could have been anyone's face at all. They had buried the locket, instead of her, in a small stone church outside London, and the Duke had stood at that grave in the rain, and made himself a promise that he would never again let his heart get away from him so completely. He kept that promise for 5 years, the way a man keeps a wound bandaged tightly, and without ever letting it heal properly underneath. And now, on a cold evening in October, he was standing in the ballroom of his own house, in his own finest coat, waiting to be engaged to a woman he had spoken to perhaps 11 times in his life. Her name was Lady Cordelia Ashworth, and she was, by every measure society cared to apply, an excellent match, beautiful in the practiced way that came from a decade of dancing masters and posture instructors. Wealthy, or rather, her father was wealthy, which amounted to the same thing when it came to marriage contracts. Accomplished at the pianoforte, fluent in French, capable of directing a household staff of 40 without raising her voice above a murmur. She was, in short, exactly the kind of woman a duke was supposed to marry. She was nothing like Eleanor at all, and the Duke suspected that his grandmother, who had arranged this match with the ruthless efficiency of a woman who had buried 2 husbands and outlived most of her enemies, had chosen her for precisely that reason. "You look like a man attending his own funeral," his grandmother said, appearing at his elbow with the silent, unnerving grace she had cultivated over 72 years of getting exactly what she wanted. The Dowager Duchess of Ashbourne was a small woman, bird-like, with sharp eyes the color of wet slate, and she had never once in the Duke's memory said a comforting thing when a cutting thing would do instead. "I feel rather like a man attending someone else's," he said. "I understand I am simply meant to stand here and look pleased about it. You could try smiling. I am told it does not require surgery. I am reliably informed I do not make them, smiles that is. Not without cause." His grandmother's mouth thinned, the particular expression she wore when she was deciding whether a remark deserved a reply or simply her contempt. 5 years, William. 5 years. You have mourned a girl who has been ash and bone in a churchyard since before your last birthday but 3. The line requires an heir. The estate requires a mistress who is not a memory. You will marry Lady Cordelia tonight, in front of every person who matters in this county, and you will do it with what passes in you for good grace. You say that, as though I have been given a choice in the matter. You were given 5 years of choice, and you spend every one of them staring out of windows. This is what remains when a man wastes his choices, Your Grace. Other people begin making them for him. She left him then, moving off toward the string quartet to have some quiet, devastating word with the conductor about the tempo, and William, Duke of Ashbourne, stood alone at the edge of his own ballroom, and let the noise of 200 guests wash over him like water over a stone that had long since stopped noticing the current. The ballroom itself blazed with candlelight, hundreds of them reflected and multiplied. In the long mirrors that ran the length of the east wall, so that the whole room seemed to shimmer, doubled and redoubled, a hall of light with no corners left in shadow. The air smelled of beeswax and hot wax dripping, of crushed thyme from the garlands strung along the balustrades, of 200 bodies in silk and wool, crowded together in October chill, turned to October warmth by sheer proximity. Somewhere, a footman dropped a tray of champagne glasses, and the small, bright crash of it was swallowed instantly by conversation, by the scrape of dancing slippers on polished floor, by the low, continuous murmur of a society that had gathered to watch a duke surrender the last 5 years of his grief in exchange for a marriage contract. Lady Cordelia stood near her father at the far end of the room in a gown of pale blue silk that suited her coloring admirably, and when her eyes met William's across the crowd, she offered him a small, correct smile, the kind one gave a business partner, rather than a man one was about to marry. He appreciated that about her, actually. She did not pretend to feel what she did not feel. There was an honesty in her indifference that he found he could almost respect. He was still looking at her, still turning that thought over, when the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. Nobody had announced a new arrival. There had been no name called out by the footman stationed there for exactly that purpose, no rustle of anticipation among the guests nearest the entrance, the way there usually was when someone of consequence arrived late. There was, simply, all at once, a woman standing in the doorway who had not been standing there a moment before. She wore a gown of deep gray, unusual among the brighter silks of the other ladies present, cut simply, without the elaborate trimmings and jewels that marked the fashionable women of the room. And over her face, from the crown of her dark hair down past her chin, she wore a veil, fine black lace that obscured her features entirely, so that she was nothing but a shape, a suggestion of a woman moving through the crowd with a stillness that made people step back from her without quite knowing why they did it. The conversation nearest the doors died first, and then it spread, room by room, cluster by cluster, the way fire spreads through dry grass, until the whole ballroom had gone quiet enough that the string quartet faltered, uncertain, and then stopped playing altogether. William felt it before he understood it, a cold drop low in his stomach, the kind of feeling a man got in the moment before he realized he had left a door unlocked, or a letter unsent, or a truth unspoken for far too long. The veiled woman crossed the ballroom floor with unhurried steps, her gray skirts whispering against polished wood, until she stood perhaps 10 feet from where William stood beside his grandmother and his intended bride, and there, in front of 200 witnesses, she stopped. And curtsied. It was not the curtsy of a stranger being introduced. It was too precise for that, too deep, held a beat too long, the curtsy of someone who had been trained in a specific household, by a specific dancing master, to greet a specific man in a specific way, years and years before. William's chest went tight, in a manner he had not felt since the morning he had received the letter about the fire. "Forgive the intrusion," the woman said, and her voice, muffled slightly by the veil, was quiet, careful, pitched low enough that only those nearest could hear it clearly. "I understand. I have arrived at an inconvenient moment." "Madam," William's grandmother said, recovering first, as she always did, "this is a private engagement ball. I do not believe you were invited." "No," the veiled woman agreed. "I was not." Nobody moved. William found that he could not, in fact, move at all, could not make his feet carry him forward or backward, could only stand rooted to the polished floor of his own ballroom, while something in his chest hammered against his ribs like a bird, thrown suddenly against a window it had not known was there. "Then I must ask you to leave," the Dowager Duchess said in the voice she used on servants who had disappointed her, and on dogs, and, William suspected, on God, when she felt he had been insufficiently attentive to her wishes. "I will," the woman said. "I only wish to offer my congratulations to His Grace. Before I did." And then, with no further announcement, no further ceremony, she reached up with both gloved hands and lifted the veil back from her face. The candlelight found her first. That was the thing William would remember afterward, turning the moment over and over in the months and years that followed. The way the light found her face before his mind had caught up enough to understand what it was looking at. Dark hair, pulled back, simply eyes, the color of strong tea, wide-set, achingly familiar. Small scar above her left eyebrow, thin and pale. The kind a child gets falling from a garden wall at the age of 9 and carries for the rest of her life. A scar he had kissed, once in a garden in Sussex, on an afternoon so ordinary and so perfect that he had never told anyone about it because it had felt like something too precious to spend on other people's ears. The ballroom did not gasp. It was quieter than that, more terrible than that. It simply stopped entirely. Every voice, every rustle of silk, every breath, so that the only sound in the whole vast room was the small dry clatter of William's own heart, and somewhere very far away a woman's glass touching a table too hard, cracking, unheard by anyone but him. "Eleanor," he said. It was not a question. It came out of him the way blood comes out of a wound. Involuntary, immediate, impossible to stop once it had begun. The woman who had been dead for 5 years looked at him with those familiar tea-colored eyes, and there was nothing triumphant in her expression, nothing of the vindication he might have expected from a woman who had just detonated a bomb inside his engagement ball. There was only a terrible, aching sadness, and underneath it, buried so deep, he almost missed it, something that might have been hope. "Hello, William," she said. "I did try to write ahead. But I was told quite firmly that letters from dead women tend not to be believed." Somewhere behind him, William heard his grandmother make a sound he had never once heard her make in 30 years of being her grandson. A small strangled sound, not of surprise, but of something closer to fear. He turned to look at her, and what he saw on her face in that unguarded second told him more than 5 years of grief ever had. She was not surprised at all. She was caught. "You knew." He said the words came out of him low and disbelieving, and the whole ballroom, still frozen, still silent, heard every one of them. "You knew." She was alive. "William." You knew he was not shouting. He would think later that it might have been easier if he had shouted, if the rage in him had come out as noise instead of this cold, quiet, terrible clarity. 5 years. 5 years. I stood at a grave that held nothing but a melted locket, and you knew. His grandmother's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in William's memory, the Dowager Duchess of Ashbourne had nothing at all to say. It was Eleanor who spoke, instead, quietly, into the vast, listening silence of the ballroom. "She did more than know, Your Grace," Eleanor said. And she was not looking at William now. And oh. She was looking at his grandmother, and there was iron in her voice, underneath the softness, iron that had not been there 5 years before, when she had been a laughing girl of 19, who drew wildflowers in the margins of her letters, and had never once needed to be hard about anything. She arranged it. The room, if it was possible, went even quieter. "That is a monstrous accusation," the Dowager Duchess said, but her voice had lost its usual crisp certainty, had gone thin and brittle at the edges, like ice about to give. "It is not an accusation, Your Grace." Eleanor's chin lifted. "It is a fact I have spent 5 years gathering the proof of, and I have brought that proof with me tonight, because I understand a man is about to sign his name to a marriage contract, and I did not think it fair to him, or to Lady Cordelia, for that matter, to let that happen without first telling him the truth." William felt the floor tilt beneath him, though it had not, of course, moved at all. To understand how a dead woman came to be standing in a ballroom 5 years after her own funeral, one has to go back to the night of the fire itself. And to understand that night, one has to understand what kind of man William's grandmother truly was. Beneath the sharp tongue and the bird-like composure, and the 72 years of getting precisely what she wanted, the Dowager Duchess of Ashbourne had been born the second daughter of an earl with a magnificent title and an empty treasury, and she had spent her entire life since learning the many small cruelties required to keep a great house standing when the money underneath it had long since run dry. She had married William's grandfather for his fortune, and had come, over the decades, to genuinely love the power that fortune gave her, if not the man himself. When her son, William's father, had died of a fever that took half the county with him one terrible winter, she had transferred the whole of her formidable will onto the grandson who remained, determined that he, at least, would not squander what the family had spent 3 generations accumulating. And when Eleanor Winslow, daughter of a baron whose estate was mortgaged twice over, and whose charm had long since stopped covering for his debts, had captured William's heart so completely that he spoke of marrying her within 8 months of their courtship, the Dowager Duchess had recognized, with the cold clarity she brought to every problem, precisely what kind of disaster this represented. Eleanor had no fortune. Worse, her father's debts were the kind that, upon marriage, would become entangled with the Ashbourne name, the Ashbourne credit, the Ashbourne reputation. The Dowager Duchess had tried reason first. she had tried in her way: kindness, inviting Eleanor to tea, testing her, probing for weaknesses she could exploit to end the match without her own hands appearing to be involved. But Eleanor had proven infuriatingly to be exactly as good and as clever as William believed her to be, and the Dowager Duchess had come to understand that reason would not work, because William's heart was not a thing that listened to reason at all. So, she had turned to more direct methods. The fire that consumed the Winslow estate had not been an accident. This was the first terrible truth Eleanor carried with her into that ballroom, and she delivered it in a voice that did not shake, though the effort of keeping it steady was visible in the white line of her knuckles, where her gloved hands gripped a small leather folio she had brought with her. "Your man came to our house that night," Eleanor said, and now she was addressing not just William, not just his grandmother, but the whole silent ballroom, because she had understood somewhere in her 5 years of exile that the only protection a truth like this one could offer was the protection of being spoken loudly, in front of witnesses who could not later be paid to forget they had heard it. "A man named Grimsby. Your Grace's steward of business, is he not? He came to my father with an offer, money enough to clear every debt against the estate, in exchange for my father breaking the engagement and sending me away somewhere the Duke would never think to look. My father refused him. He loved me more than he loved his own comfort, whatever else might be said of him, and that same night the house burned." "That is an outrageous suggestion," the Dowager Duchess said, but her voice cracked slightly on the word outrageous, a hairline fracture that everyone in the ballroom heard. "My father did not survive the fire," Eleanor went on. And here, for the first time, her composure wavered, her voice dropping, thickening, the old grief breaking through the careful control of 5 years' practice. "I did, because our housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who had served my family for 30 years and who I believe suspected something was wrong the moment Grimsby left our house that evening, woke me in the night and pulled me out through the servants' passage before the smoke reached the upper floors. She hid me. She told everyone, including your Grace's own agents, who came asking questions in the days after, that both Winslows had perished. She did this because she did not trust that whoever had set the fire would not simply try again if they learned I had survived it." William's hands had gone very cold. He was looking at Eleanor's face, the face he had memorized once, years ago, in a garden in Sussex, and finding it both entirely familiar and terribly changed, aged not merely in years, but in some deeper way, the way a person's face changes when they have spent 5 years learning to survive on nothing but their own vigilance. "Why did you not come to me?" he asked, and the question came out rawer than he intended, cracking open something in his chest that he had kept carefully shut for half a decade. "Eleanor, why did you let me believe you were dead?" "Because I did not know, for a very long time, whether I could trust that you were not part of it," Eleanor said, and the honesty of that answer landed on him like a physical blow. "Forgive me. I do not say that to wound you. I say it because it was true, and because I have promised myself, standing outside these doors tonight, that I would tell nothing but the truth in this room, whatever it cost me. I did not know who had ordered the fire set. I only knew that your grandmother had tried to buy my father off, and that within a day of his refusal, our house was ash. I did not know if you knew. I did not know if you had asked her to do it, in some cowardly way, hoping to have your engagement broken without the unpleasantness of breaking it yourself. I would never. I know that now," Eleanor said quietly. "I have known it for some time. But I did not know it then, William. And a girl who has just watched her father burn to death does not extend the benefit of the doubt easily to anyone." The silence in the ballroom had a texture to it now, a held quality. 200 people breathing shallowly so as not to miss a single word of the ruin unfolding in front of them. "Mrs. Pruitt took me to her sister's home in Yorkshire," Eleanor continued. "I lived there under a different name for the better part of 2 years, working as a governess, because it was the only trade a gentlewoman with no fortune and no family could practice without questions being asked. I told myself every day that I would gather proof before I ever showed my face again, because I understood that if I simply appeared and made accusations, I would be dismissed as a madwoman, or worse, quietly disposed of a second time more thoroughly. "And did you gather it?" William asked. His voice had gone hoarse. "The proof?" Eleanor lifted the leather folio she carried, held it out toward him, though she did not yet cross the remaining distance between them. "Mrs. Pruitt kept a diary," she said. "She has kept one her entire life, a habit from her own mother, she told me once. In it, she recorded the visit from Mr. Braun, Anne Grimsby, the date, the sum offered, the words exchanged between him and my father as best she overheard them through the study door. She recorded, too, the night of the fire, and her own suspicions, and the arrangements she made afterward to keep me hidden and safe. She gave me this diary 3 years ago on her deathbed, and told me that the truth was owed to somebody, even if it could not undo what had already been done. That is the ravings of a servant woman. Nothing more," the Dowager Duchess said. But her voice had grown thin as paper now, and William, looking at her, saw something in her face he had genuinely never seen there before in 30 years. Not guilt, precisely. His grandmother was not, he suspected, capable of guilt in the way ordinary people were, but fear. Fear of consequence, finally. Arriving 5 years late. "It might be, Your Grace, if it stood alone," Eleanor said. "But it does not stand alone. Because, 2 years ago, once I had saved enough for my position as a governess, I traveled to London, and I found Mr. Grimsby himself, retired now from Your Grace's service, and I asked him, very directly, whether he remembered visiting my father on the night our house burned." She paused. The whole ballroom seemed to lean toward her. "He did not deny it," Eleanor said. "In fact, he was rather relieved to unburden himself of it, I think. Guilt is a heavy thing to carry alone for 5 years, and I do not believe Mr. Grimsby ever expected to be asked to answer for what he had done. He gave me a written statement, signed and witnessed by a solicitor of good standing in London, confirming the offer he made to my father, on Your Grace's explicit instruction, and confirming that when my father refused, he reported the refusal back to you directly, the same evening the fire began." She opened the folio and withdrew 2 documents, holding them up, not for William alone now, but turning slowly, deliberately, so that the guest nearest could see the paper, the signatures, the wax seal of a London solicitor pressed into the corner of each. "I do not claim to know for certain who struck the match," Eleanor said. "I have never found proof of that. And I will not make an accusation I cannot support. But I know who paid for my father's ruin to be arranged, and I know who benefited from the world believing me dead for 5 years. And I have carried the weight of that knowledge alone for far longer than any woman should have to." William turned to face his grandmother fully now, and the Dowager Duchess, who had spent 72 years learning never to flinch in front of an audience, flinched. "Tell me it isn't true," he said, and there was something in his voice that had not been there a moment before, something that made even the string quartet, still frozen with their instruments lowered, look away from him. "Tell me, grandmother, that you did not pay a man to destroy the only family the woman I loved had left in this world, because you judged her unworthy of carrying our name." The Dowager Duchess's composure, built over 7 decades, did not crumble all at once. It went in pieces the way old plaster does a hairline crack, widening slowly into collapse. "I did what was necessary," she said finally, and her voice had dropped, had lost every trace of its usual imperious command, had become for the first time William could remember, simply the voice of an old woman justifying herself to a room that had already judged her. "That family was drowning in debt, William. Marrying her would have dragged his house down with them. I offered the Baron a generous sum to simply let the engagement lapse quietly. He refused it. What happened after that was not my design." "Was it not?" Eleanor's voice was very quiet now, very still, and somehow that stillness carried further across the ballroom than any shout could have. "Mr. Grimsby's statement says otherwise, Your Grace. He says, you told him, and I quote his own words, written in his own hand, that if the Baron would not take money for a peaceful end to the matter, he should be made to understand that Ashbourne always gets what it wants, one way or another. I have wondered for 5 years what those words were meant to permit him to do, I think, tonight. The room understands it, as well as I do." A murmur finally broke the silence of the ballroom. low, horrified, spreading outward from the guests nearest the small tableau at its center. A murmur that carried the particular electric quality of 200 people realizing simultaneously that they were witnessing the complete and permanent ruin of a woman who had, until this evening, been one of the most powerful hostesses in the county. "You will not speak another word of this in my house," the Dowager Duchess said, turning on Eleanor with something of her old fire returning, a last, desperate attempt to reassert the dominance that had governed this ballroom, this family, this entire county for decades. "It is not your house," William said. The words fell into the silence like a stone into still water, and the ripples of them moved outward across every face in the room. "It has not been your house since my father died, grandmother," William continued, and his voice, though quiet, carried the particular authority that came from a man, finally, fully understanding his own power and choosing for the first time in 5 years to use it without hesitation. "You have run it as though it were, because I allowed you to, because I was too buried in my own grief to notice how much of my life you had quietly taken into your own hands, while I was not looking. That ends tonight. William, be reasonable." "I have been reasonable for 5 years," he said. "I was reasonable when I let you plan an engagement to a woman I do not love, because I told myself it did not matter who I married, since the person I truly wanted was already gone. I was reasonable when I let you manage every account, every tenant dispute, every decision of consequence in this house, because grief had made me a passenger in my own life. I am done being reasonable, grandmother. I find I have run rather short of patience for it, given what I have just learned you did to secure my reasonableness in the first place." He turned then fully to face Eleanor, and the whole room seemed to hold its breath along with him. 5 years, he said, and his voice had changed entirely now, had dropped every trace of the cold fury he had turned on his grandmother, had become something raw and unguarded, the voice of a much younger man, the voice, Eleanor thought, doffed a boy who had kissed a scar above her eyebrow in a garden in Sussex and told her that he intended to love her for the whole of his life and count himself fortunate for the privilege. 5 years I stood at her grave with nothing in it but a melted locket, Eleanor. 5 years I told myself that grief was the only thing I had left of you and that I owed it to you to carry it faithfully because it was all that remained. And you were alive. You were alive and afraid and alone, working as a governess in Yorkshire under someone else's name, and I did not know. "I know," Eleanor said, and now her own composure broke at last, the tears she had been holding back through the whole terrible recitation finally spilling over, tracing bright lines down a face that had aged 5 years in grief, and hiding in hard, careful work. "I know, William. I am sorry. I am sorry for every day you spent mourning me, and I am sorry that I could not find a way to spare you that grief without risking everything Mrs. Pruitt had sacrificed to keep me safe. I told myself every single day that I would come back when I had proof enough that the truth could not be dismissed as the ravings of a grieving, hysterical woman. I told myself that you deserved better than my suspicion of you. And I hated every single day that I could not simply trust you enough to come sooner." "You had every reason not to trust anyone," William said. "I do not fault you for that, Eleanor, not for one moment of it. I fault myself for not looking harder, for accepting a melted locket as proof of your death, when I should have demanded to see more, for letting my grief become an excuse to stop asking questions, when the truth was sitting there waiting for someone brave enough to keep digging for it." He crossed the remaining distance between them, then closing the gap that had stood between them for 5 years in the space of perhaps 6 steps, and he took her hands, the gloved fingers still trembling slightly around the edges of the leather folio, and he held them the way a man holds something he has been told over and over that he would never be permitted to hold again. "I loved you for the whole of those 5 years," he said, quietly. Now quietly enough that only she, and perhaps the very nearest of the frozen silent guests, could hear him properly. "Even believing you gone, I do not think I ever stopped, not for one single day, and I do not intend to waste a single day more pretending that I could. Somewhere behind them, Lady Cordelia Ashworth, who had stood through the entire unraveling of the evening with an expression of careful, controlled composure, finally spoke, and her voice, when it came, held none of the outrage or humiliation the room might have expected from a woman whose engagement had just dissolved in front of 200 witnesses. "I believe," Lady Cordelia said, stepping forward, "that this engagement was never going to end well for either of us, Your Grace, and I find I am rather relieved to be spared it." A ripple of astonished, uncertain laughter moved through the nearest guests, the first sound in the room that was not shock or horror, and Lady Cordelia allowed herself a small, wry smile. "My father arranged this match for the settlement, not for my happiness," she said, quietly, to William, though loud enough that those nearby could hear it. "I do not think either of us imagined we would grow to love one another, Your Grace. I wish you joy of the lady who has quite dramatically returned to claim you. I mean that sincerely. I have watched you these past months, and I have never once seen you look at me the way you are looking at her now." "Thank you," William said, and he meant it, the gratitude of a man who had been spared an unhappiness he had not had the courage to refuse himself. The Dowager Duchess, meanwhile, had gone very still, standing alone now at the center of a ballroom that had, in the space of perhaps 20 minutes, entirely abandoned her. The guests nearest her had, without quite seeming to move at all, created a small distance around her, the particular social exile that a woman of her rank had spent her whole life inflicting on others and had never once imagined might be turned upon herself. "William," she said, and her voice had lost every trace of command now, had become something small and frightened, an old woman facing the end of everything she had spent 70 years building. "William, whatever you believe of me, I am still your grandmother. I still love this family. Everything I have done for the sake of the name, for the sake of the line. You had a man burn a house to the ground with a father inside it," William said, and his voice was very quiet and very final. "You let me believe the woman I loved was dead for 5 years so that you could arrange a marriage more convenient to your own vanity. I do not know what love you believe you were acting from, grandmother, but I no longer recognize it as anything I wish to have a part of my life." "What will you do?" she asked, and there was real fear in the question now, naked and unhidden. "I will send for the magistrate in the morning," William said. "I imagine Mr. Grimsby's statement, along with Mrs. Bellia, Pruitt's diary, will be of considerable interest to him. I do not know yet whether the law can reach far enough to punish what you did 5 years ago. But I know that this house will no longer shelter you while it tries to find out. You will remove to the dower cottage at the edge of the estate by week's end, and you will live there on an allowance sufficient for your comfort and not 1 shilling more, and you will not set foot in this house again unless I invite you to it, which I do not anticipate doing for some considerable time." The Dowager Duchess opened her mouth as though to argue, looked around at the ballroom full of witnesses who had, until an hour ago, treated her word as something close to law in this county, and found, for perhaps the first time in her life, that she had no audience left willing to take her side. She left the ballroom without another word, and the sound of her slippers against the polished floor, quick and unsteady, was the loudest sound in the room until the doors closed behind her. For a long moment afterward, nobody spoke at all. Then William turned back to Eleanor and found that she was watching him with an expression he had not seen on her face. Since before the fire, since before 5 years of grief and hiding had taught her to guard every feeling behind careful composure. Hope, unguarded, and something that might have been the first true happiness she had allowed herself to feel in half a decade. "I have imagined this moment for a very long time," she admitted, quietly, and a small, unsteady laugh escaped her. The sound of someone who could not quite believe the ground beneath her had finally stopped shifting. "I confess I imagined it going rather differently. Less public, perhaps." "I find I do not mind the audience," William said, and for the first time in 5 years, in front of 200 witnesses who would tell this story in drawing rooms across the county for years afterward, the Duke of Ashbourne smiled, properly without reservation, the smile of a man who had been told quite firmly that he did not make them. "Let them see it. Let every person in this room understand exactly what I intend to do next." He went down on one knee, there on the polished floor of his own ballroom, in front of the ruins of one engagement and the astonished silence of an entire county's worth of witnesses, and he took Eleanor's hand in both of his own. "I do not have a ring prepared," he said. "I did not think, this morning, that I would need one. I have only myself, and everything that is mine, and 5 years of love that never once managed to become the past tense. No matter how hard I tried to make it one. Eleanor Winslow, will you do me the very great honor, a second time, of becoming my wife?" Eleanor's answer came through tears and through laughter. Both at once the particular sound of a woman who had spent 5 years surviving on nothing but the hope of this single moment. "Yes," she said. "Yes, William, 1,000 times yes." The ballroom, which had spent the better part of an hour in absolute, frozen silence, finally broke into sound, applause, and exclamation, and the particular delighted chaos of a society crowd that has just witnessed the single greatest scandal and the single greatest romance of the decade unfold in the same 20 minutes, and would spend the rest of their lives telling the story of the night the dead fiancé came back, and the Duke's grandmother was ruined in front of them all. The magistrate came the following morning as William had promised, and the evidence Eleanor had spent 3 years gathering proved more than sufficient to strip the Dowager Duchess of what remained of her standing in the county, if not, in the end, her liberty entirely, for Mr. Shia Grimsby, it turned out, had been the one to actually set the fire, on instructions he had understood clearly enough. And it was Mr. Grimsby who ultimately faced the harshest judgment the law could offer. But the Dowager Duchess's name was ruined beyond any repair her fortune might once have purchased, and she lived out the remainder of her days in the small dower cottage at the edge of the Ashbourne estate, visited by no one, writing letters that were never answered, keeping ledgers of accounts that no longer belonged to her. For the habits of 70 years do not die simply because the power behind them has. Mrs. Pruitt, though she had passed before she could see the fruits of her courage fully realized, was remembered. William had a small stone placed in the churchyard at Ashbourne in her honor, inscribed simply with her name and the words, "She kept the truth safe until it was ready to be told," and Eleanor visited it every year on the anniversary of the fire, laying wildflowers at its base. The same wildflowers she had once drawn in the margins of her letters as a girl of 19 who had never imagined the world could ask so much of her, and still leave anything worth having behind. William and Eleanor were married the following spring, in the same small church where an empty grave had once held nothing but a melted locket. And this time the whole county came not to mourn, but to celebrate. And the locket itself, recovered and repaired, was placed around Eleanor's neck by William's own hands on their wedding morning. He told her, not of what had been lost, but of everything that had, against every reasonable expectation, finally been found again. The estate, once Eleanor took her place as its mistress, became known throughout the county for a particular kind of quiet generosity that had never existed under the Dowager Duchess's rule. Tenants who had once dreaded quarter day found a duchess who listened to their troubles before she collected their rents. Servants who had learned under the old regime never to speak unless spoken to found themselves cautiously at first, and then, with growing confidence, invited to share their opinions at a table that had once run entirely on fear. And it became something of a tradition in the Ashbourne household, one that visitors always remarked upon with some bemusement, that no one, whatever their rank, was ever made to wait outside a closed door for word of whether they would be received. The doors of Ashbourne Hall, Eleanor decreed early in her tenure as its mistress, would open for anyone who knocked upon them in good faith, because she had spent too many years learning what it cost a person to be shut out. A year after the wedding, on an ordinary evening with no ball and no crowd of witnesses to mark it, William found his wife in the garden at dusk, sketching in the small leather notebook she had carried with her since Yorkshire, a habit she had never abandoned even after fortune made such careful economy unnecessary. He sat beside her on the stone bench, and she showed him what she had drawn, wildflowers, the same ones she had always drawn, and beneath them, in her careful hand, she had written a single line that made his throat tighten with the particular ache of a happiness he still sometimes could not quite believe he had been allowed to keep. She had written, simply, "Found, at last." He took her hand, The way he had that first evening in the ballroom and held it the way a man holds something he has been told over and over that he would never be permitted to hold again. And out across the darkening lawns of Ashbourne, the lights of the house glowed warm against the coming night, every window lit, every door unlocked, waiting for whoever might yet come home. Thank you so much for staying with this story all the way to the end. If you felt even a fraction of what William and Eleanor felt in that ballroom, I would love to hear about it. Tell me in the comments which city you're watching from tonight, and tell me what this story made you feel. And if you have a favorite line from everything you just heard, share it below, because I read every single one of them. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing so you won't miss any new stories we tell here. We have so many more waiting for you. Until then, from all of us here, good night and sweet dreams.